Hello and welcome back to the Damage Report. I'm John Iadarola, and for only the second time in the history of this show, Michael Brooks is in studio.
Absolutely.
How's it going, Michael?
It's great.
Great to have you here. We've gotten a chance to talk a few times. You've Skyped in. Obviously, you're not from this neck of the woods, but we appreciate you and your time out on the West Coast making time to be on the show.
Of course.
If people are not familiar with you, and that's probably not likely, but if they're not, tell them a little bit about your show. What do you do?
I host a show called The Michael Brooks Show. You can catch it Tuesday nights on YouTube on the Michael Brooks Show YouTube channel, starting at around 7 o'clock New York time. I don't even know what time I'm in now. I'm really bad with even
upside
super
down.
Modest time changes. Confuse the hell out of me. And then if you're a patron, you get illicit history episodes and the post game, and we focus a lot on international relations, a lot on history, and we're also having a good time.
Okay, yeah. So there's a lot of people who ostensibly do lefty YouTube, independent media or whatever, but would you say that that's one of the biggest things that makes your show yours, is more of a historical focus, a broader focus on news going on around the world?
Yeah, it's probably, I mean, it's very globally focused. The historical focus is unique. And we're, it's we're not trying to be like a subculture in any way, and we have a really broad set of guests, but it has a very clearly like socialist Marxist analysis.
Yeah, a little bit more of a sort of historic, political, academic,
like a political economy thing. But don't worry, it's really funny and really entertaining.
It is.
We can't get the brand too twisted here.
It's basically like an advanced philosophy course.
It's like it's like if PBS was on YouTube and there was no entertainment value. No, it's not like that at all.
No, and that's awesome because look, there's a lot of niches that people put themselves into. That is one that deserves people to be in it, and there aren't a lot of other examples of it. So I appreciate you doing that. I also come from academia. I've forgotten everything I learned there, but I appreciate others who have not.
I don't. I only have a bachelor's degree, man.
Well, there you go.
I just read.
And look, sort of on theme for your work, we're going to be doing Meanwhile In later today. We've got news from a couple different parts of the world, including Bolivia, which you've been talking a lot about.
Fantastic.
You're going to talk about it on our show.
Excellent.
Awesome. So lots of other stuff we're gonna get to. The best way to find out what we're gonna get to is just tuning in for the whole show. So with that, we're gonna jump into our first big topic. Yesterday's impeachment hearings, according to some people, had a pretty big bombshell. Here is one of those people.
But what we heard today was that he himself was making and partaking in some of these phone calls, not just Giuliani, not just anyone else in administration, but him. And that really adds a much more disturbing degree of the involvement that he had in using the powers of government to create politically motivated investigation.
So that is Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who seems to think that something important was said yesterday, which is weird because I've been watching the media's reaction to those hearings, and she's missing that the big standout component of these hearings is how much of a snoozer they are. So here's the NBC News tweet analysis. The first two witnesses called Wednesday testified to President Trump's scheme, but lacked the pizzazz necessary to capture public attention. Not to be outdone, Reuters deployed this: consequential but dull. They begin without a bang. And can you really impeach a man if you don't have a bang? And then others, NBC News had this, noting that the big Bill Taylor revelation, which we'll talk more about, was more of a footnote than a headline, which was news to NBC News, who literally had it in a headline. If you go into the next one, news to NBC News, it's a footnote, by the way. You're not supposed to put it up there where people can see it. And the thing that really bothers me about this is that it's not the media's job to tell people, oh, by the way, don't tune in, this thing's boring. It's to assess the evidence that's presented, among other things.
Yeah, I mean, this is the problem. I mean, it's so frustrating to talk about this process on so many levels, partially because I think my perspective on it is one that basically ends up annoying everybody. But taken on those terms,
it's fun.
It actually is fun in a weird way. But yeah, I mean, this is it's the horse racization of everything, right? It's who's up, who's down, how is it being played, and I'm honestly, when you go into politics, and I think we like to talk about elections and the process and so on, but the actual stakes are what make this significant. Like I never understood, if you really just want the game, why aren't you covering the NBA? It's much more fun.
Yeah,
the games
or
are
esports
better.
or something.
Well, no, not esports. No respect for esports. I'm just kidding. No.
We found out yesterday that AOC plays League of Legends, so we've got one in my corner now.
I stand corrected.
But yeah, just do sports reporting.
Just do sports reporting. Talk about the movie business. Talk about, I mean, even
box
business
office returns.
Business. Yeah, so I think, and then the other juxtaposition that's hilarious to me is that there's all this like maudlin melodrama about Trump and, a whole bunch of people in the center or the mainstream or whatever you want to call it that don't want to have the real fundamental analysis about Trump, but also how we got to Trump. And then all of a sudden, when the process happens, it's almost like, well, he's not a Russian body double, so boring.
Yeah, Yeah. We don't critically analyze how we got here, and to the extent that anyone talks about how you actually get us past this whole thing, it's generally like Biden saying, "Oh, you just vote out Trump, and then we'll be cool. Everyone will be working together again. The Republicans will be super excited to work with Joe Biden."
Well, that's utterly delusional. I mean, unless it involves cutting entitlements, and I think it's just really disturbing because on one hand, I think you have some people more in my neck of the woods on the left that, for all of the correct criticisms about how Russia was covered and things like that, which we could unpack at some other time, they're ignoring the fact that this is Trump is in an ongoing pattern of massive executive overreach, which is a fundamental threat to democratic process. And then conversely, all too many members of the Democratic Party and so on are just sort of like, oh, well, the CIA says he's not doing a good job, so he's not doing a good job.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, what happens when a president, say we do elect a President Sanders and he actually tries to go up against US foreign policy in a constructive and positive way, the same process will play on him.
I think they'll be
people
open-minded.
need to look. Yeah, they'll be right.
Yeah.
They'll be thinking, they're just concerned about the facts. And right.
And by the way, you can do a full 24 hours on the impeachment hearings and still tie in some of the things you talked about. Like you can bring up the executive overreach even in the context of the hearings. Like we have Bill Taylor's testifying, but what about the people that aren't testifying and why aren't they testifying? Because Donald Trump apparently didn't get the memo from Lindsey Graham that obstruction of justice and an impeachment inquiry is itself an impeachable offense, and he's decided that nobody should talk, while at the same time complaining that nobody has firsthand information that's testifying.
Bill Barr helped cover up Iran-Contra.
Yeah.
This is a whole direct history of not only executive overreach, quote unquote, but a formalization of executive impunity. This is another area where Trump goes, "It's not a crime. I can't do one."
Yeah.
That's actually what a lot of people think. They wrote what he said in a law journal article that sounded more sophisticated, but it's the same sentiment.
Yeah, and like in the same way that Ned Stark was brought to King's Landing because he was the only honorable man in the kingdom, Bill Barr was brought in because he's the least honorable, and he was brought in to cover up future scandals. And for some reason, the Democratic Party doesn't care about this, but Bill Barr tried to cover up this one. If he had gotten his way, we would have never found out about the whistleblower. Whistleblower blew the whistle. The DOJ said, nope, there's nothing there. We're not gonna do any interviews. This thing is done. And only because the whistleblower responded to that by going outside of the normal channels did we find out about any of this. If that hadn't happened, Bill Barr would have succeeded. Zelensky would have had his Fareed Zakaria interview, and all of the campaign talk right now would be, man, Joe Biden is looking really bad, this investigation that has nothing to do with Donald Trump. And so for some reason, Bill Barr is so far clean in this whole thing. But one other thing about the media reaction to this, I agree with you that it's the next step in the horse raceation of all of politics, but it's looking at this process from a particular individual stereotypical point of view. And that is from the point of view of Donald Trump. How exciting is this? How are the ratings for this? Oh, it's boring, it's a snoozer. It doesn't matter what the content is. It's either something that's gonna bring ratings or something that's gonna lose ratings. Why is Reuters and NBC News and CBS, all of these looking at it through the lens of Donald Trump, the guy who is almost on trial for this?
I mean, I think because leadership flows from the top. And he's helped reset the parameters of modern politics. But again, I think we were already there in so many ways. And I think that is, there was, here, I'll do a real TMBS reference. There was an essay that came out in 2016 by a Cameroonian philosopher named Achille Mbembe called The Age of Humanism is Ending.
I read that one.
Right, fantastic.
I did not.
I actually thought you did.
No, I didn't,
Got
sorry.
me, man.
I wish, but no. That would have been awesome.
It would have
been
dope. It said that our institutional frameworks of even sort of modern day liberalism are hollowed out and disappearing across the globe. And that things, whether we're talking about Gaza or different areas of incredible concentrated abuse and inequality, are gonna become increasingly the norm. And he wrote this in the decay of 2016, but before the rise of Trump and Bolsonaro and all of these figures. And I just think that you can't, it's such a thread that you have to walk between, I would love to see impeachment seriously damage Donald Trump, but it is not a magical bullet, and it's not going to get us out of the predicament we're in, or even in fact, the political fights that we actually have to win, because we know he's not gonna be removed from the Senate. And I think, what I think is disturbing is the press shouldn't be reporting it like this, but I could see plenty of normal people, both because Trump is Trump, and also because they're so burned out. I mean, even this story, the fact that there is a connection to Joe Biden, that setting everything else aside, why is his son on that board? It's disgusting, and it reminds everybody of these systems problems, and that's what we need to get to. And the last thing I'll say with regards to Trump, it's funny that you want to get more sexy, exciting stories, talk about Trump's relationship to the mafia. There isn't even any speculation about that. That's not some fever dream of Jonathan Chait. That's real.
True. Okay, we are gonna have to move on, lots to get to. I do wanna just briefly mention before we go to our break, we are aware, obviously not far from where we're broadcasting this right now at a high school, again, not very far away to our north. There is a shooting that was up until very recently ongoing with multiple victims. As of us going live, the perpetrator had apparently killed himself. And so we are watching that, obviously. We don't have much more actual information to report at this time, but that is something that's going on in the very close to us. So just bear that in mind. With that, we are gonna take a break. We come back, lots more to get to.
We need to talk about a relatively new show called the Republic, or UNFTR. As a Young Turks fan, you already know that the government, the media, and corporations are constantly peddling lies that serve the interests of the rich and powerful. But now there's a podcast dedicated to unraveling those lies, debunking the conventional wisdom. In each episode of the Republic, or UNFTR, the host delves into a different historical episode or topic that's generally misunderstood or purposely obfuscated by the so-called powers that be, featuring in-depth research, razor-sharp commentary, and just the right amount of vulgarity. The UNFTR podcast takes a sledgehammer to what you thought you knew about some of the nation's most sacred historical cows. But don't just take my word for it. The New York Times described UNFTR as consistently compelling and educational, aiming to challenge conventional wisdom and upend the historical narratives that were taught in school. For as the great philosopher Yoda once put it, you must unlearn what you have learned. And that's true whether you're in Jedi training or you're uprooting and exposing all the propaganda and disinformation you've been fed over the course of your lifetime. So search for UNFTR in your podcast app today and get ready to get informed, angered, and entertained all at the same time.
Senator Bernie Sanders and Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez recently teamed up for a big series of campaign events in Iowa, and today they're teaming up once again on a very important piece of legislation called the Green New Deal for public housing. AOC tweeted initially some of the details about it, saying that it's going to decarbonize the entire US public housing stock, improve the quality of life for residents, and create hundreds of thousands of jobs in the process. To give you some more information about the bill, which you should definitely look up because there's a lot to it. We can only ever give a sort of brief overview. It's going to use 7 grant programs to upgrade housing units into carbon neutral communities with organic grocery stores, on-site childcare, and community gardens. Residents of public housing would be given preference in hiring to renovate those units. And to give you an idea of the scale of the problem, there are over 1.2 million units of federally subsidized housing units across the country, and much of it hasn't been meaningfully repaired or upgraded in decades. And if you live in one of those units, that might mean, it doesn't look great, or it might mean that your water goes out for literally weeks and you just have to deal with it because nobody's going to fix it, nobody's cared for decades. We're gonna have some more, including a cost, but for the first sort of team up legislation between these two, I like the direction they're going in.
It's fantastic, and I think it fits with, Bernie Sanders putting out by far the most aggressive and expansive housing plan with national rent control, which I'm a strong supporter of. And what always strikes me when these pieces of legislation get introduced and things that Sanders' campaign has put forward and some of the things that people like AOC are working on in Congress, is that one, it actually attempts to tackle problems that just have been either been band-aided or made worse for decades. Secondly, it's radical in our current political context, and it's disturbing that it isn't just common sense, but that reflects where we are economically and politically, obviously. And third, I love there's a real systems thinking approach to it, which I love, right? It's like, okay, this needs to be an ecological upgrade, but it also needs to be in such a way that supports quality of life, jobs, nutrition, childcare, education, that all of these things are interdependent systems, and we can actually design policy in such a way that affects them, their relationships together, and then empowers people to work on them, themselves in their own contexts. And it's fantastic. I mean, it's just there's nothing but positive things to say about it. It's a natural outflow of this really important partnership.
Yeah, and look, initially earlier this year when the Green New Deal was sort of being mapped out, and a lot of the focus and the rhetoric was on, this is not just about the climate crisis, or at the very least understand that the climate crisis is about things other than the climate. I don't think necessarily everyone understood those connections, but as more and more pieces of this legislation are rolling out, including earlier this year, AOC's like 6-part anti-poverty plan, those connections are becoming far more clear. And you do need this sort of program if you need this and many other pieces if you're going to get to not just carbon neutrality, but moving even beyond that. And that's why when someone will talk about like, I proposed cap and trade 10 years ago. It's like, okay, that's good. Or I want to subsidize more like clean energy. Okay, awesome. But that's just one thing. And it doesn't necessarily show that you understand the interconnected nature of all of these systems. Again, as you were saying.
Not only that, I would actually say that it's a danger, because we'll have a situation where, first of all, the whole frame of like people need to accept the science, I don't agree with, because when the right accepts the science, their answers will be even, okay, there's gonna be climate refugees. Let's have even more violent, grotesque border policies. Let's racialize this even more. Look at the terrorist attack in Texas several months ago. If you read the shooter's manifesto, it's a combination of the worst of white nationalism and an ecological assessment that isn't entirely wrong at all. So there's a profound danger in that. And then if you do the neoliberal centrist wing, you're going to primarily come up policies that alienate people. I mean, the whole yellow vest movement in France is emerging from a gas tax in part, right? So you're saying your life, your well-being is antithetical to dealing with this urgent crisis. And then they turn around and they say, oh, AOC, and Bernie, they're including all these other things. That's confusing. And it's like, not only is it not confusing, it reveals that you are not able to think at the scale of the problem. And I don't want to, and those fights between a dead, discredited center and an emergent fascistic right are a profound danger to all of us. And so when they do this, they chart something really synthesizing justice and ecology. That gets us where we need to go.
I agree. Now there's a lot more on this. AOC lays out how it's going to be funded. She talks about how with the hundreds of thousands of jobs that this is going to be generating, that when we talk about dealing with climate change, we're not talking about either we help the economy or we do something about climate change. That is what people with a vested interest in maintaining the capitalist status quo want you to believe. It's not actually true, and this legislation proves it. So go take a look at the legislation. It's freely available. AOC has tweeted about it. With that, though, we do have to take a short break. When we come back, Jordan Smith is gonna be joining us. Reporter is gonna break down the Rodney Reed case after this. Despite renewed media interest and literally millions of people getting involved in putting pressure on politicians to, at the very least, delay the impending execution, Rodney Reed, who's been facing this lack of interest on those who could get more evidence, find out what's going on, is still set to be executed. And joining us now to talk about this case and where it might go from here, senior reporter for The Intercept, Jordan Smith. Welcome to the Damage Report.
Yeah, hi, thank you for having me.
Very glad to have you here. And so I know that this is a case that you've been following for many years at this point. For people who might not know about Rodney Reed and how we've got to this point, can you give us basically a brief idea of what this case is all about?
Sure. Rodney Reed was sent to death row for murdering a 19-year-old woman named Stacey Stites back in 1996. The key to the prosecution's case, what they said was the key, which they harped on as being the smoking gun and the Cinderella slipper, was that there was DNA from Reed that was matched, excuse me, to Stites. And this sort of propelled forward a stranger encounter theory of the case, that he had basically sort of raped, attacked her, strangled her, and then dumped her body. What Reed said was that they were actually having a consensual affair, and that at first he didn't come out with that because it would have been dangerous, because Stites was a white woman, he was a black man, and Stites at the time was engaged to a white cop. So that's sort of the backdrop.
And so as you've laid out, you had a great Twitter thread breaking down a lot of this. You've written articles as well. Much of what originally was thought to be true in this case turns out that upon further investigation to have fallen apart. And there's quite a lot of holes in the state's case against Rodney Reed, correct?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, there are a lot of problems. It's sort of hard to know where even to begin.
Well, that's a good point. Well, why don't we start with the cop that you just talked about? So initially seemed like, from what I have read, was the initial suspect. Then the Rodney Reed stuff came out, and in the years since, this cop has seemed a little bit more suspicious, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's really, obviously Jimmy Finnell, which was the fiance and the cop. He from the beginning was a suspect, and that's important on a couple levels. Number one is that they knew that this DNA existed, and they knew that it did not match Finnell. So in other words, at the very beginning of the investigation, the idea that the DNA was the linchpin of the case just did not exist. They were not looking at it that way. It wasn't until after the DNA was matched to Reed that Finnell is basically dropped as a suspect, and now suddenly this DNA is dispositive of what happened to Stacey Stites. The other problem is that the state's entire sort of theory of the case is built along a timeline provided by Finnell that is based on, sort of speculation. They shared an apartment together. She worked early morning shifts at a grocery store in a nearby town. And, when she doesn't make it to work that morning, Finnell says, well, we were together all the night before and everything was fine. She went to bed early. She would have gotten up at 3. I didn't get up at 3, but she would have gotten up at 3 and left right around then. And here's the roads she would have taken in driving into work. So they based their whole theory on this sort of idea that Finnell knew what was going on when he really didn't, because by his own account, he was asleep.
Yeah.
And then another thing that's like sort of inexplicable to me and always has been early on is that they never sought to search the apartment that they shared, even though it was arguably the very last place she was seen alive. And that's just never sort of made much sense to me. And at trial, Reed's lawyers had promised to, demonstrate that there was this consensual relationship between Stites and Reed, and they utterly dropped the ball. It was the one thing they promised the jurors, and it was the biggest thing, and they just did not deliver on it. There were witnesses who could have testified to that, and they weren't called. And I think that's primarily because a lot of them were related to Reed, but there were others who were not related to Reed who were also not called. And so, there was really nothing to challenge this idea that Reed, attacked her, which is also weird because she's driving on a state highway in a car and somehow he's supposed to overcome her while on foot, attack her, get in the car, strangle her, and just sort of dump her body.
Yeah.
Which, of course, again, doesn't make that much sense either. But they just didn't even have a coherent narrative to challenge that, as sort of ludicrous as that theory may sound. Subsequently, though, in the intervening years, and to be honest, it was not very long after he was convicted in 1998, where a lot of, it's literally in the intervening years, it's been like this sort of steady drip of information and investigation that have just sort of turned up things that were just never told to the jury. There were people totally unconnected to Reed who were aware of this affair, including in Stites' family. There were people she worked with, who she didn't really socialize necessarily with outside of work, and they knew about it. And then there's sort of the Fennell problem, which is that there were a lot of witnesses that came forward afterwards to say that Fennell had a rather racist and violent past and present. And those were things that were not known either. And along the way have just sort of been, shrugged off, including one that sort of always bothered me. There was a Dallas area police officer who was in an academy training with Fennell in 1995. And she overheard him talking to someone else saying, if I ever caught my girlfriend cheating on me, I would strangle her. And Stites was strangled with a braided belt. So, stuff like that all along. And then, ultimately Fennell has some problems that sent him to prison.
Well, and also there are now multiple witnesses that say that they have overheard him, in effect, either seem to claim credit for the killing or to outright say that he killed her.
Right, absolutely. I mean, there have been, in recent months, there's been new affidavits where two members of law enforcement individually have come forward. One related sort of a disturbing incident at Stites' funeral where Fennell is seen sort of looking over her coffin sort of menacingly and saying, "You got what you deserved." Then there's another officer who was actually friends with Fennell and with Stites and relates an encounter not long before her murder where they were hanging out at the apartment complex where Fennell and Stites lived, and Stacy goes off to the pool and Fennell stays behind with his friend, and they're talking by this barbecue pit, and he basically comes out and says he knows that Stacy is having an affair and she is having it with N-word. And this guy said he was totally sort of startled by this whole thing and disturbed, and that after then Stacy died, Fennell's behavior was sort of so increasingly strange and uncomfortable that he really wondered if Fennell was responsible for Stites' death. And this guy eventually sort of cuts off all contact with Fennell. Mm-hmm. And he explains why he didn't come out then. It was that in 96, he said he left law enforcement, he left Bastrop, this sort of small town, and yet he still had family living in Bastrop, and he was worried about how it would impact them if he came out and looked like he was going against law enforcement. And, to me, I think that's you kind of wonder, why do you take so long? But at the same time, I think that's a legitimate concern, and I can understand it.
So as of right now, I mean, he's been in prison for quite a while. He's facing execution. There are now, I believe it's up to almost 3 million signatures in an online petition to put a halt on this. I believe there's one state lawmaker who has requested that as well. From what you've seen, does it seem like, considering all that's come out and the public attention on this case, that it might receive a stay?
Oh, man. It's Texas. It's really hard to know, right? So one thing that's important to understand is that the governor in Texas has limited sort of power in this arena, and the governor can issue a temporary reprieve, right? absent any sort of recommendation for clemency or commutation or anything else that comes from the Board of Pardons and Paroles, he's sort of can't do anything. Although at the same time, it's useful to note that the Board of Pardons and Paroles is appointed by the governor. So it's hard to imagine that he couldn't transmit information to the board, signaling what he wanted. Abbott's been in office in Texas quite a long time, and before becoming governor, served for 12 years as the Attorney General. And it's the Attorney General's office which defends these death convictions that we have. And he defended, his office defended Rodney's conviction the whole time. So it's really hard to know. And as governor, he's only sort of intervened in one case. So, I mean, the odds would be against it. However, I think that, there's been a lot of people speaking out, obviously. And I think, to be honest about it, I would imagine that the voices that maybe have the most influence with him are the GOP lawmakers, including Senator Ted Cruz, who have come out and asked for this, the brakes to be hit here. I think if anybody has the stroke to kind of influence what he might do, it would be members of his own party.
Well, we'll have to see, while bearing in mind that obviously there is a lot on the line here. Jordan Smith, we really appreciate you joining us on the show and breaking this down for us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. We are gonna take a short break. When we come back, Lou Dobbs responding to the first day of the impeachment hearings, helping to spread an insane conspiracy theory involving George Soros. After this. The information revealed in the first day of the public impeachment hearings could lead a rational news show to discuss what this means for the impeachment effort. Does it increase the risk to Donald Trump of being impeached? Or alternatively, it could lead to this.
Well, there's no doubt that George Soros controls a very large part of the career foreign service of the United States State Department. He also controls the activities of FBI agents overseas who work for NGOs, work with NGOs. That was very evident in Ukraine. And Kent was part of that. He was a very big protector of Soros. His testimony today showed this kind of stern, sort of discomfort with not being included in certain discussions. But the truth is, George Soros had a daily opportunity to tell the State Department through Victoria Nuland what to do in Ukraine. And he ran it, Soros ran it. He corrupted FBI officials, he corrupted foreign service officers, and the bottom line is this: George Soros wants to run Ukraine, and he's doing everything he can to use every lever of the United States government to make that happen for business interests, not for good government business.
So they've found the corruption in Ukraine. And by the way, that message brought to you by the network that was incensed with Ilhan Omar for her anti-Semitism, spreading these conspiracy theories about George Soros. And by the way, there's that segment, obviously. That wasn't Lou Dobbs talking, to be fair. But in the past, just a couple of months ago, Lou Dobbs warned about George Soros's financial tentacles spreading across the world, which is like both anti-Semitic and also sort of James Bondian a little bit.
Yes.
And also Fox Business Network had to condemn statements made by a guest on Lou Dobbs' show after he suggested the migrant caravan headed from Central American countries to the US was funded by billionaire liberal philanthropist George Soros, who is Jewish, which is, by the way, what the terrorist who shot up the Tree of Life synagogue believed was going on. Lou Dobbs brought on a guest to spread that conspiracy theory because one shooting like that apparently wasn't enough.
I mean, the other point about this though is that crazy guy is a former, I believe, US attorney saying that, right?
Yeah.
And this is
crazy.
really, this is so important. I mean, there was a case of a anti-police brutality activist, Black Lives Matter activist, getting under legal pressure and threat. I believe he was imprisoned, due in part to an Alex Jones report that law enforcement officials watched. So this again is the other challenge of this time. You get these insane conspiracy theories spread by these people, but then the answer can't just be, we have to trust these institutions because these institutions have, first of all, some very reactionary histories. If you look at things like COINTELPRO, and you have people like, Rudy Giuliani was the mayor of New York City.
I know.
And by the way, nothing he says or does should surprise anybody. If you looked at what he was doing as mayor, his policies on race, policing, this is who he is, and it shouldn't surprise anybody. The last thing I'll say is I think it's a good, this is a good pitch for a socialist view of the world, because you can understand how finance and money works without turning it into a deranged fever dream about George Soros.
That is true. And just a reminder for if you're like me and you don't watch these networks, I get them generally from Media Matters or something like that. That wasn't on Fox News. That clip was Fox Business. I love to get my business news while finding out about like Jewish billionaires with tentacles around the world.
Well, you
and
got to
lots of
see
stuff
what
about
you
God
might
and
opportunities for Ukraine.
Exactly.
I mean, as an example, I could tell you the year of the caravan was, I don't know if it affected you guys, it was bad for me. I requested from Mr. Soros some expansion money, and he said it was all locked up in the caravan.
Yeah.
So, you do need to know what's happening.
We've had people say that TYT is like owned. Do you think George Soros knows who I am? I seriously doubt it. I seriously doubt that. So we do have to take a break, our last break. By the way, I do want to mention, quick update to the shooting story we were talking about earlier. Apparently the initial reporting saying that the shooter in this case had killed himself was inaccurate. He did shoot himself, but apparently survived and is now in custody. So just a little update for you there. We're gonna take a short break. We come back, meanwhile in. And now it's time for news from around the world in Meanwhile in. Meanwhile, in the Marshall Islands, we're seeing a consequence of climate change I don't think anyone predicted, but we have to go back just a little bit, some quick history to get us to the point that we're in right now. Between 1946 and 1958, the US detonated 67 nuclear bombs on, in, and above the Marshall Islands, vaporizing whole islands, carving craters into shallow lagoons, and exiling hundreds of people from their homes. Now, after it finished nuking the island dozens and dozens of times, the Pentagon dropped biological weapons, mixing it up. Once the US was finished, it scooped up that soil, poured it into a crater left behind from a nuclear detonation, mixed it with concrete, and covered the whole thing in a concrete dome that they called it the tomb. So at that point, we were good, right? But unfortunately, climate change is breaking that dome open because rising sea levels are starting to flood it. It's cracking, and now nuclear waste is spreading into the Pacific Ocean. Michael Brooks, nobody could have predicted it.
Nobody could have predicted it. And I heard the stat recently, I believe that no country has had more of those weapons dropped on it than the United States.
We should look into who did it.
Yeah, we gotta figure out what the hell is going on.
67 times.
67 times.
It's insane.
I mean, it is absolutely insane. And it's also another micro example of colonialism. You guys are gonna have to leave. Because we're gonna liquidate your island.
Yeah, and by the way, so we're talking about the nuclear waste that's leaking out now. That's a disaster. It's going to continue to be a disaster, but it was already a disaster before the dome started to crack, because even the people who moved away, in some cases, didn't move far enough, and they've been experiencing the effects of that radiation ever since. Birth defects are so common that people have a number of words to describe them, among them marlins, devils, jellyfish children, and grape babies for the particular clusters of symptoms from the radiation-caused birth defects. So even before the crack, that's what our government did to these people, because they happened to live in an island chain that we thought would be convenient to drop some bombs on. Now, we have a related story actually, meanwhile in. All around the world in our global war on terror, this time not using nukes, thankfully, it is still costing a lot in dollars and lives. The war on terror launched by the US government in the wake of the September 11th attacks has cost at least 801,000 lives and cost $6.4 trillion, according to new pair of reports, a new estimate. I have heard estimates before that were quite high. This is the highest, and we just pretend that it was a rough war, but you know what? If we have to continue forever in Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, maybe it's necessary.
It's the framework, right? I mean, we had the Cold War, then in the 1990s, we looked for a new sort of like macro understanding of the world that could, basically justify US imperial hegemon. And we had this humanitarian intervention phase, which was a disaster.
Like all throughout the 90s.
It was all throughout the 90s. And then it fused together in 2001 with on one hand, we have to go and lay waste to the world because of a specific small terrorist group. And then on the other hand, somehow we can also be like the bomber wing of human rights. And it still goes on. I mean, we are under Trump's civilian rate casualties are skyrocketing. Obama, of course, codified and expanded the covert aspects of the war. And it is still the framework that governs how we do foreign policy and fused very much with Israeli policy in Gaza.
Yeah, and by the way, as high as that estimate is, and that's insane, horrifying, the actual numbers are likely far higher.
Absolutely.
The civilian death toll across all regions is up to 335,000, nearly 42% of the total figure. But the report doesn't include indirect deaths, namely those caused by loss of access to food, water, infrastructure, war-related disease, all things that tend to be caused by wars. And some experts who study this say that indirect deaths are estimated to be about 4 times higher than direct deaths. So there you are talking about the likelihood that millions of additional people were killed thanks to this war on terror.
Absolutely, without a doubt.
So horrifying news, but with that we are going to turn to a slightly different story. Meanwhile in Bolivia, and never has that image fit the story less, but we're gonna proceed. We're in the aftermath of this.
I'm sorry.
We have them for a lot of stories, and sometimes it fits, sometimes not so much. Scotland's got a goat in it. Sometimes that's appropriate. Anyway, so I've lost my train of thought. So look, Michael, yes. I wanted you to talk about Bolivia and what's going on there right now. There's a lot of, I would say, information and misinformation coming out. We're seeing takes from the US government. I saw a headline that was US pleased with developments in Bolivia, and I thought, maybe speak for yourself on that, but.
I would say that's US government, that's an accurate headline. Last weekend was a major event in Latin America. I mean, you had the release of political prisoner Lula da Silva in Brazil, and that has huge ramifications. And then there was a coup in Bolivia. And in such a short period of time, I guess I'll just say 2 quick points. One, let's be really precise and pedantic. It's a coup, regardless of what you think of Morales. If the military says, we would like you to leave, that's called a coup.
And he is currently in Mexico City.
Exile, and by the way, fleeing like neo-fascist paramilitaries that wanted to kill him. The second point is, and this is what happens a lot, is that people expect complete purity from governments operating in the periphery under a lot of pressures. Morales lifted a lot of people out of poverty, and to the extent there was legitimate criticisms of his government from the left, all of those things are gonna be subsumed by what is at the end of the day a far-right movement that hates indigenous people and is aligned with US interests. So there's a lot more subtleties to tease out, but it's important to recognize that. 1, it's a coup. 2, if you have legitimate concerns about Morales, don't be a naive fool about what this actually means from an ecological or an indigenous rights perspective.
Now, and social movements,
on
that, like if you have concerns about how the election was handled or something like that, we've had elections here that are contested. You have an investigation. You don't run the candidate out of the country.
And for what it's worth, the opposition said even before, we'll contest it, but we're gonna protest no matter what. For me, the Center for Economic and Budget Priorities put out a really good analysis of this. I'll have the former Ecuadorian foreign minister on my show next week to talk about it. I think, frankly, him winning 47% in terms of the geography of the country and where it came from makes, like, I believe those numbers.
Now, and again, apparently polling leading up to the election basically got the numbers pretty well.
Yeah, basically got the numbers pretty well. But the bottom line is, is that 1, it's bratty and delusional to expect perfection from any leader, let alone one in a place like Bolivia. And 2, he accomplished a lot of things, and to the extent the project was failing or running into speed bumps and contradictions, if you think that this, a right-wing movement, almost certainly empowered by the United States, would be my guess, is going to improve upon the ecology of the Amazon or the rights of indigenous people or workers, I have a demo tape and a real estate opportunity. Hit me up on Twitter.
Yeah, and the likely coming threat to the indigenous community, that's one of the scariest parts of this. I mean, there were some quotes that came out initially, really scary, and seeing that at the same time that Jair Bolsonaro is like, he's got it in for these people. We
Argentina and Brazil through the sort of like big cattle ranch and mining interests, they're definitely involved in that as well. And Lula centered that, and it's very serious times in Latin America.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us, not only for Meanwhile In, but for the whole show. Where can people see more of your work?
Patreon.com/TMBS, get the whole thing, or Michael Brooks Show on YouTube, and follow me on Twitter and all that. It's
awesome.
Pleasure being here, man. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you here, and you're gonna be on the main show on Friday, so tune into the second hour of the main show tomorrow. You can see more of Michael. Thank you, of course, for tuning in as always. Tomorrow, I believe JR is gonna be joining me, so tune in tomorrow morning. You'll see JR Jackson. We'll see you then. Thanks for listening to the full episode of The Damage Report. Support our work, listen ad-free, access members-only bonus content, and more by subscribing to Apple Podcasts at apple.co/TYT. I'm your host, John Adarola. I'll see you soon.